Welcome. You're listening to KZSC's Voces Críticas, Critical Voices. I am your host, Silvana Falcone. Today I have an interview for you with Dr. Rebecca H. Rosser. She's a director of the UCSC American Indian Resource Center. She earned an MFA in Exhibition Design and Museum Studies at CSU Fullerton, an MA in American Indian Studies from UCLA, and her doctorate in American Studies from the University of New Mexico. Dr. Rosser's current work focuses on raising awareness about the experiences of Native American students in the university setting, with particular attention to the stereotypical expectations surrounding Native identity. She has worked in a variety of institutions, including the Southwest Museum in Los Angeles, the Indian Pueblo Cultural Center, UCLA's American Indian Studies Center, and the Center for Southwest Research. Dr. Rosser is Mexican-American, Mescalera, and Warm Springs Apache. Welcome, Rebecca, to KZSC's Voces Críticas. I'd like us to first talk about terminology and status in order to give us a framework in which to have an understanding of Native America. First, can you explain the differences between a federally recognized tribe and a state-recognized tribe?
The system in the U.S. is set up that if a tribe has a treaty agreement with the U.S. government, then they're recognized by the U.S. government as a sovereign nation. That sovereignty allows for them to have a government-to-government relationship with the U.S. and creates a centralized government, right? So they have a leader that's elected and a tribal council that's elected by the citizens of that tribe. And the citizenship is defined by membership in that particular tribe. And therefore, those citizens that are enrolled members are also recognized by the U.S. government as having a kind of dual citizenship, right? They're members of a sovereign tribe, but also U.S. citizens. So tribal members participate in both governments. We can vote in our tribal elections as well as in state and federal elections. And it's an important status in as much as it allows for members of those tribes to receive whatever kinds of government support there are. So, for example, Indian Health Service, and in the case of students, scholarship funds. So usually almost always, these things require evidence of membership. So the tribes give membership cards or letters or something to prove that they are citizens. So there is a very formal way in which we engage both with the government and then as citizens of a tribe. So federal recognition, right now there are 567 federally recognized tribes, and of those 567, 229 are in Alaska, and the rest are in 33 other states. It's interesting, there are many, many tribes, and I think people don't know that. Most times they don't recognize how many there are.
So once you are recognized by the federal government, then the state recognizes you as an official tribe. But what about the other piece of it? Can you be recognized by the state? The states have their own processes for tribal recognition. Can you be recognized by the state and then not recognized at the federal level?
Yes, okay. And that's especially common in California, where there are many state-recognized tribes, and they are acknowledged by the state of California as existing, but the U.S. government doesn't acknowledge them. So they, again, aren't eligible for a lot of services, the opportunity to apply for grant funding, for federal government support. And students sometimes, they have documentation that they're a member of a state tribe, but a lot of scholarships will only honor federally recognized tribe documentation.
And so then there's also this other category of tribes that exist but have no recognition whatsoever. So what does it mean then to entirely lack recognition at the federal level or at the state level for these particular tribes?
What it means in the conversation of being a tribe that's recognized by others, it's very difficult to receive that level of respect and acknowledgement because there's nothing that one could look to, quote unquote, validate the fact that you are a group of people that have organized yourself and have long-term record keeping and, all of those things. I mean, often that's what helps tribes become state recognized. So when a tribe has no recognition, which is also very common in California, they're really at a loss because many people won't engage with them or, tend to discredit them or just altogether ignore them. But there are many groups in the state that are working now towards state recognition, and that tends to be a step-by-step process. So they go first to the state, and then after they gain state recognition, they typically have a better chance of becoming recognized by the federal government. It's not impossible to become a federally recognized tribe in contemporary U.S. However, it's incredibly difficult. So there are so many things that are required in order to make that happen. And for folks that are interested in knowing how that works, they can visit the National Congress of American Indians website, and that gives a very detailed explanation of tribal sovereignty and also how tribes become tribes and what's required. And there are a lot of scholars today who believe the U.S. government would prevent any additional tribes becoming federally recognized just because it doesn't serve their interests, right?
Yeah, I was going to say it really doesn't serve their interests
right.
In terms of wanting to acquire more land. And we saw all of this eruption, obviously, around Standing Rock. The less Native people that they recognize, the better for their sort of
Absolutely.
Capitalist expansion.
Absolutely.
So let's talk a little bit about terminology. We have terms like American Indian, we have terms like Native American, we have terms like Indigenous. Mm-hmm. How do you use these terms? Do you use them interchangeably?
I personally don't have an issue with any of that terminology. I think used respectfully, any of those terms are great. The center that I direct, for example, is the American Indian Resource Center. People may refer to me as Native, Native American, Indigenous, and all of those are fine. And most people I know that are Native are fine with those terms if they're American Indian and not from south of the border, or even Canadian who prefer to be called First Nations. Most Native people would say the best way to introduce someone you know or to speak to someone is to acknowledge their actual tribe and to say they're a Cherokee or a Lakota. But Mescalero has a very complicated history. Almost all tribes do. And so after the Chiricahua and other groups were taken and as prisoners of war to Florida for 27 years and returned, they had a choice of going either to Mescalero or to Fort Sill in Oklahoma. So my ancestors returned to New Mexico, but they were all taken to the reservation and all enrolled under one tribe, even though there were multiple tribes there. So that's not an uncommon phenomenon.
And so where do most Native Americans or Native peoples live today? We had talked earlier in our conversation about how depiction of Native folks living just on reservations is not necessarily a holistic representation of where Indigenous peoples live today in the U.S.
Mm-hmm. Well, I looked this up after we talked, and in 1970, about 62% of American Indians lived off the reservation, and from the 2010 census, now 71% live off reservations. So what does that mean exactly? I would venture to say most are living in urban areas. And then, of course, there's a term we talked about, which is the suburban Native, right? Which is many of us, they're now multi-generation urban. And then there are some that live in rural areas, of course. And I think, there's a lot of reasons for that. But yeah, you're going to find most people live off the reservation, and then when they want to connect with the community, they go home.
So what are some of the challenges that are facing Indigenous peoples today in terms of opportunities for mobility? So by mobility, I'm thinking about opportunities for education or opportunities for labor or types of work. What is affecting, or what are some of the challenges affecting their mobility? I
would say that most of it has to do with the fact that we're still, as an entire population, mostly not college educated. So, and I do want to preface this by saying I recognize that college is not, it's kind of checking my own privilege, that college is not really everybody's ultimate goal, right? But what does impede, I think, the ability for Native people to have financial security and job security is the fact that if they're coming out off reservations, most times they don't have very good opportunities to learn a skill, or they're not college ready, or they're sort of overwhelmed by the experience of leaving a community of people they've grown up with their whole life, just like people coming from small towns, right? The urban experience is interestingly similar. Most people that I work with, in fact, I can say most of the students that I work with are first-generation college students. So, they're grappling with conflicting feelings about being away from their families and getting an education or whatever that looks like. But I would say just access and information and encouragement all throughout their life.
You are listening to Dr. Rebecca Hernandez Rosser, the director of the American Indian Resource Center of UC Santa Cruz. Let's talk a little bit about your dissertation. In your dissertation, which is titled Past is Perfect in the Present Tense, Exhibiting Native America in Museums and Cultural Centers, what did you learn about the relationship of representation, of culture, and identity in your dissertation research?
Well, this was of particular relevance to me because I'm actually trained as an artist, and I came up through in the university as an art student. And when I went to college in New Mexico, I went to the College of Santa Fe and the Institute of American Indian Arts, and there were a lot of conversations around Indianness, and these conversations happen in all ethnic communities. But I think what I found most interesting was the attachment that non-Native people had toward art made by Native people, and the kinds of questions that got asked about who they were as people, their tribal enrollment. I mean, all kinds of questions that got asked that never got asked other artists. And I just found that fascinating. So as I moved on and went on to earn my MFA, I started delving into a lot of conversation around museums and museum didactic materials. And also that was when the conversation around public representation of culture was just kind of at it, had just doors swung wide open, and people were doing a lot of writing about this. So what I ended up doing was saying, well, I'd like to work with Native collections while I'm an artist. And I knew nothing, of course, while I was an art student, even about what happens in a museum, what goes on behind the scenes. I want to make very clear that this journey has been I sort of joke that it was an accidental experience, but I went on to UCLA to study American Indians so that I would be well prepared to work with Native collections. And that was the first time in my life that I was exposed to any kind of information about American Indians. And it was an enormous learning curve, and it was painful, and it was an awakening for me that I think I was so naive about our U.S. history, about Native people in general. Just from a scholarly perspective, I knew nothing. It was an opportunity for me to start to ask, well, I'm in this program at this very prestigious university, and I was very grateful for it and wonderful peers. But I noticed that a lot of the conversations that we were having in the classroom, especially when the professors were non-Native, were, still kept returning to this idea of how do we determine nativeness? How do we understand nativeness? How do people label themselves? How do people outside the community label us? There were so many things going on that I started to look into the way museums, galleries, and cultural centers did that work. So my whole thesis really was examining terminology. What is authentic? What is genuine? What is Indian made? What is, all of these words that you hear in the visual arts that identify objects and ultimately the artist. So some things are artifacts and some things are contemporary. And so I started thinking about this, and I was finishing up and ready to move on, but I was encouraged that I should continue the work. And one of the things that I was really interested in was Native Christian art, which is never talked about, but a huge part of the collective of Native art. And so I went on to UNM, the University of New Mexico, and that was what I started grappling with, was how come some art is, held up as beautiful reflection of Native culture, but somebody creates vestments for a priest or an altar tablecloth or paints the interior of a church, and somehow that just goes unnoted because of the discomfort around how it doesn't identify Native the way non-Native people feel comfortable. It's very complicated, right? So it got so theoretical for me, I think, that I love doing the work, and it was a terrific topic to learn about and think about. And that was for me, as someone who produced art and knows a lot of artists and engages with artists a lot. Sometimes we would laugh about it. Sometimes we would lament that people really don't understand contemporary Native identity at all. And they're still looking for something in their imagination, right? This is the dilemma of the American Indian, I think, today, is that people are still looking for that image in their mind, and they're not going to find it. That may have existed at one time. I don't even know. But I think now we're such a diverse community that, people need to appreciate that more than anything.
Well, I think it gets us out of this monolithic one way to be Native image.
And I was really saddened by the effect it had on artists, because artists felt tremendous pressure to create things for the marketplace that would help support their life, right? So if something is going to sell that has a particular look to it, or if they want to make a living as an artist in an art market that is very particular, they feel oftentimes very pressured to produce a particular kind of object or painting or whatever it might be. And then there are Native artists, many who I admire tremendously, that, they said, yeah, I'm Native and I'm an artist, but my art is something else entirely, right? And I think that was a fun, not to make light of the scholarship, but for me, it opened the door for me to talk with a lot of artists and a lot of people, culture producers, right? People that created very traditional objects, right? Like pottery and woven objects, as well as folks who may reject all of that as a form of art that they just weren't interested in, and they wanted to be an abstract painter or, do photography or whatever. And it was, it was fun. It was a great way to examine something I really love a lot. There's also amazing protest art that I wrote about, and that's a form of art you rarely hear talked about in public space, right? There are a lot of things that I wish the public had more access to see that diversity again, of Native experience.
When I don't know if you got a chance to see the Black Panther exhibit at the Oakland Museum of California, but there was an incredible, you walk in and there was just this incredible art that emerged from the Black Panther movement. And I said, wow, you kind of forget that these massive social movements, even the American Indian Power movement, the Right Power movement, incredible art that generated during that time in terms of political and protest art. Last year, you brought Ron Finley to campus. He's the founder of the Ron Finley Project, which is a project dedicated to creating a healthy food culture in South Central Los Angeles. And in your introduction to him, you made a very provocative opening, and you said there are many ways to kill an Indian. One of the reasons you brought the Ron Finley Project and Ron Finley himself to campus was to think about food and the lack of access to healthy foods in communities of color and in Native communities in particular. In what ways is this reality then contributing to that quote-unquote killing of Native peoples today?
One day I stumbled upon Ron Finley's film trailer, and I was feeling particularly down that day, and I just watched it over and over and over again. And I was so moved by just the trailer, because literally you could put exactly what he said was identical to what's happening with American Indians. High rates of disease due to lack of access to whole food. That was it. And, as Ron Finley talks about in his film, right, he would have to have gotten on his bike and gone almost 10 miles from where he lived to get any fresh produce, because there's no grocery stores in his neighborhood. Well, most reservations don't have a grocery store. In fact, I would think it would be safe to say 95% don't. And then the border towns, you have to have a way to get there. And for urban folks, we know many of the parents who are caring for these kids sometimes have to work 2 jobs, sometimes have limited income. So if you can feed your kid for $5 or spend a lot of time going to buy groceries, coming home, cooking, prep time, all of that stuff, if it's just made so easy for you to make an unhealthy choice, as human, we're going to make that unhealthy choice. It's just the reality. And children are marketed to. That's the other thing. So, when I talk to the students I work with, they say, well, when everything in your neighborhood is fast food and your parents want to feed you, that it just makes sense that way. Or they have to feed you on a budget, and so they shop at stores that don't have fresh produce, but everything is either highly processed or has a long shelf life, for a whole number of reasons. And this is just the common denominator for most poor or low income families, regardless of who they are. And it's a national epidemic, but it's certainly one in the Indian community that we have to do a better job at addressing.
That's why I so appreciated Michelle Obama's initiative for Let's Move, healthy eating. I mean, she got so much incredible pushback from conservative forces who thought, who is she to tell us what to eat and this and that, completely missing the entire point of her initiatives. She was able to put that as a national conversation. What is being fed in school cafeterias? What are, low-income children getting exposed to in their neighborhoods or in their communities? Why are convenience stores that are located predominantly in working-class communities or near native reservations so filled with processed foods. And so she was able to shed that to light in a way that I don't think has happened on a national scale, fully understanding that the audience here, I think, were communities of color for her.
Well, it's very profitable.
Oh, definitely. Right? When she had said this criticism around McDonald's, I thought, oh my goodness, Michelle Obama.
And convenience store food and drink, I mean, it's so inexpensive. I marvel at how little you can pay to walk out the door for a bag full of food, but none of it is healthy. None of it's really good for your kids, especially, and just laden with sugar. I mean, I'm not just talking drinks. I'm talking about anything that is highly processed has a lot of sugar in it. And so that is contributing also to diabetes. And I've been thinking a lot, or I've been working with one of my students on making a poster board that has sugar equivalents. So things like Yoplait yogurt, for example, some of their yogurts have as much sugar as a can of Coke. So you give your kid this Yoplait yogurt to go to school thinking that you're making a healthy choice. So they don't make it easy either for us to know what is good and what isn't good. And it's not a secret that Americans are really addicted to sugar. So we're going to gravitate toward things that help us with that addiction. This is a topic that's comes close because I myself was diagnosed 2 years ago with diabetes, and it's a disease that has affected almost every member of my family, both, immediate, like my nuclear family, but also all of my uncles, aunts, many cousins. And it's a disease that I saw really affect my mother's life, and it really had this enormous effect on me. I couldn't talk about it for almost 2 years. I felt a tremendous amount of shame and anxiety over it. I was really sad. And, I couldn't understand how this would happen, right? Because I convinced myself that I was doing everything that I could, but I wasn't. I had to also then, at that moment, grapple with the fact that I wasn't doing everything that I could to have prevented it. So what I started to do was read about the health issues facing American Indians, but also the fact that for American Indians, diabetes it's literally a crisis. It's affecting not just adults, but children now. Of course, that's directly related to things like obesity and alcoholism, and just, poor diet. And I never thought about these issues, and I never ever thought about things like food justice. And I didn't even hear that term until I came to UC Santa Cruz 3 years ago. And so what happened was, it was, serendipitous, I guess, that when I first came to campus, I noticed a lot of things going on that made me very uncomfortable about the way people discussed nativeness, the stereotypical ways in which people spoke about me, to me, about the culture and community. And I was really taken back because I had never had an experience like this before. So I'm just being totally honest. It was almost unbelievable at times. So as a consequence of that experience, I started talking to interns and others about their experiences in the classroom, and Indigenous students were sharing that they were also grappling with a lot of misinformation and very ignorant comments and stuff. So all that to say, one of the things that resulted from that was the directors having a conversation around students that are interested in environmental studies and things related to that area of study that are students of color, and how difficult it is for them to participate in what all the amazing things that are going on this campus, and finding it just an unfriendly space for them. So we got together and had a conversation, and we decided to start with the People of Color Sustainability Collective hashtag, and it just exploded. I mean, I can't tell you. It's nothing I expected to have happen. And as a consequence of that, I started to have conversations with Adriana Renteria, who was the first coordinator of the initiative. And it just took off. It has a life of its own now. But one of the key things that we wanted to address was the fact that communities of color, of which, of course, American Indians are part of, are disadvantaged across the board when it comes to our communities having access to food and to things that are good for us. And as a consequence, it affects our health overall. I never had these conversations. I never even thought about it. I never thought about how fast food really wasn't that good for you. I mean, I'm just being totally frank, right? I mean, I grew up in Southern California, in the suburbs. This was just part of our life, still part of my family's life and my life. I think my generation probably had a lot more food cooked at home, but I'm noticing as I talk to college students, that's more and more and more rare. So from a young age, we're eating food that really isn't supporting our health. And it might sustain us temporarily, but it's not very good for us. Many of the students that we work with at the ethnic resource centers have diabetes as students. So that's a reality that I think for me helped to open my eyes to the fact that I needed to really start to interrogate what was actually going on and empower myself rather than feel wholly responsible. I started to talk to students who have taught me so much, and I'm indebted to them. My interns are amazing young people and helped me to really appreciate that. It's taken them coming to college, and most of them got involved as high school students in the conversation around food injustice, really, and wanting to help their communities make better choices.
I mean, you're really hitting on two really core things. One is the knowledge piece. Like, I think, too, about how much fast food I had as a kid, and it's kind of like mind-boggling. That there's that piece, and then the other piece is the access piece. There's lack of access to these healthy foods, and then there's a lack of knowledge or access to the knowledge as to why we need to eat things in moderation or certain kind of sweets in moderation, and that was not necessarily what we were exposed to. How can students interested perhaps in joining the People of Color Sustainability Collective do so?
To tell you a little bit about the collective, it's an initiative that was started to recognize the contributions made by people of color to sustainability well before it was called sustainability, right? And to honor our ancestors and the folks that came before us in the way that they were creatively used things to live. And a lot of it was reused and repurposed. And a lot of folks, again, it took a tremendous amount of creativity to do what they did, but we all learned growing up things like sharing is a sustainable practice. So something as simple as clothes swaps and, with cousins and things like that. I mean, these are things that people felt shame around when they would bring it up in class because it was looked at as an activity of the poor, not as a sustainable practice. So the whole purpose of People of Color Sustainability Collective was shifting that conversation and helping people appreciate that it may look different than what is talked about in most classrooms or in the field, but it's just as sustainable and just as relevant a contribution as anything else. So we have a lot of fun with it, and it's been really, I can say, I've learned so much from the students who are actively engaged in it. And it is an initiative out of our center, but anybody can come by the American Indian Resource Center or go to our website and find out more about it. And we do a lot of workshops and events around topics that would be of interest. And I just want everybody to know, our goal is to empower students of color, but also to be there for every student who wants to better appreciate and engage with others around this topic and do so in a fun way, So we bring really great speakers to campus around these topics.
I love the shifting of the discourse. I love that kind, because I think that is so essential to reframing the meaning of sustainability, because it does have a very sort of, again, kind of like we were talking earlier about the labels, a very limited parameters to it. But I think shifting the conversation of sustainability is essential. So I want to talk about how prisons are another way to quote unquote kill an Indian. And I was reading an article on the Huffington Post by Jamal Bell. It was written several years ago in 2010. Bell is an independent journalist and is the editor of racetalk.org. This is an online publication talking about race, gender equity, and social justice. And he wrote, quote, "The incarceration rate of Native Americans is 38% higher than the national rate. The U.S. Commission on Civil Rights attributes this higher rate to differential treatment by the criminal justice system, lack of access to adequate counsel, and racial profiling. One example, in South Dakota, Native Americans make up 8% of the state's population, and they compose 22% of the state's male prison population. Native women composed 35% of the female prison population, according to the Lakota Human Rights Advocacy of Coalition report. Law enforcement agents arrest American Indians and Alaska Natives at twice the rate of the greater U.S. population for violent and property crimes. On average, American Indians receive longer sentences than non-Indians for crimes. They also tend to serve longer time in prison for their sentences than non-Native Americans. Indians, the suicide rate is higher among American Native inmates incarcerated in jails than non-Indians, end quote. So there's a lot of incredible information there. What do you make of these grim statistics and realities that are facing the incarcerated Native population?
Well, I'll start out by saying that we can return back to the conversation we had at the very beginning about federally recognized tribes, state recognized tribes, etc. I think I owe it to your listeners to talk about this issue of jurisdiction. That over American Indians in the criminal system is so outrageously complicated. And I don't have a background in law, but I learned enough to know that definitely affects how American Indians are treated in the judicial system. So, for example, if you are an American Indian and you commit a crime on your reservation, then it's your tribe's responsibility to manage that whole situation. If you are an Indian that is tribally enrolled and commits a crime off a reservation, then there's a whole number of different ways that can go down. But most times, an individual in that predicament will rarely have appropriate legal representation. And we know that there are a lot of things plaguing our communities, and there are high crime rates both on and off reservations with Native people for a whole slew of reasons. But it is very disturbing. I think when I started to learn about these things myself, I wondered what it was that brought people to that place. And I think, again, the sense of being really disconnected from your community if you're new to a place. Also, the fact that most Native people live in communities where there might be a lot of violence and then they participate in it. And also, our youth are really, there's a lot of statistics out there that talk about the fact that our communities are struggling in a lot of ways, and especially in the areas of parenting well, healthy relationships. And as a consequence, children are often, they're neglected, or they're living on a reservation away from their parents while their parents leave to go to work, and they stay with their grandparents or extended family. And this breakup of the family comes at a high cost. We also have a very troubling statistic with our youth of suicide, that's the number one cause of death for American Indians between 17 and 24, and that's both on and off reservations. So we're also grappling with what I would call a mental health crisis, that folks are really feeling isolated, depressed, sad, hopeless, and all of that leads one down the road to feeling like there isn't an alternative. Just to share with you that my concern over it has us planning an event for the winter quarter, which will be happening in February, where we'll be doing a whole day-long American Indian health event. And it's going to be focused almost exclusively on physical health, but also the fact that a lot of American Indians don't know how to do preventative or see signs of things. And so that's really important to me that we talk about that, and especially for people here at the university that are pre-med and are thinking about becoming physicians, to know a little bit more about the possibility that they may have an Indigenous patient and how they can engage with them and talk to them and know some of the things that are pressing in that community.
You were also mentioning earlier about a prison book project.
Yes.
And so why don't we talk a little bit about how that maybe is one way to address some of these sort of grim statistics of incarcerated Native people.
The American Indian Resource Center has a prison book project that we launched last year, and we started working with Barrios Unidos here in Santa Cruz, and they put a little advertisement in their newsletter, and just letters started pouring in from Native inmates that were asking for books on a whole cross-section of topics. It was really exciting, and we were very inspired. So the letters, of course, are sometimes very painful to read, but what I like about the project is, as a service learning opportunity, the students are reminded of the tremendous privilege they have being a student, and a college student especially. When you open a letter from someone who is in prison for life, who is the same age they are and won't get out of prison until 2025 or 2030, and they are just grateful for one book. We get these letters back, and it's so moving. That's the only book they have. And they share it with the other Native people that they're incarcerated with. And we received a beautiful letter from a woman who is in life in prison, and she decided she wanted to start a reading group with Native women, and there's a large number of them in this particular facility. So we're going to send her books that we think would be a great start to a reading group. They're just so thankful for the smallest contribution to shift their day-to-day experience in prison. And we know as scholars that knowledge really changes who you are, and it opens up your mind. I think for them, they feel so much more empowered. And some of them, send us beautiful artwork that we put up in the center, and they make us things. And it's just the most important thing for me is to do what we can, because we have books all around us every day, all day, and we don't think twice. And yet someone gets one book or a magazine, and it just makes a world of difference to them. So the students, for me, it's important also for us not to forget our incarcerated brothers and sisters. There's so many, and many of them are the same age. And most American Indian students that I work with, myself included, have had family members incarcerated, so we also understand how it affects families when someone is absent and will be for a long period of time.
What I appreciated about this HuffPost article by Bell is that he talked and sort of challenged the mass incarceration discourse to not neglect the inclusion of Native people in that discussion. Oftentimes it's dominated by sort of an African American and Latino incarceration rate, but he was saying we cannot actually forget the incarceration of Native peoples because it is so disproportionately high. Well, thank you so much for coming on the show with us today. Really appreciate hearing your voice and having you with us.
Thanks.